Picture this. You're sitting comfortably on your throne, sipping your favorite beverage, when suddenly someone questions your authority. What do? Well, if you're anything like the rulers we're about to discuss, you might consider feeding them to your pet crocodiles, or perhaps turning their skull into a fancy wine goblet. Oh, did that get your attention? Good, because we're about to dive into the most deliciously dark tales of royal savagery that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's tea party. Now, before you continue scrolling, let me tell you something fascinating. One of the rulers we'll discuss today had such a peculiar morning routine that it involved counting their enemies' severed heads while eating breakfast. Just a casual Tuesday morning in the 15th century, right? But here's the real kicker. These aren't fictional characters dreamed up by some twisted screenwriter. These are real historical figures who actually existed, walked the same earth as us, and made decisions that would make modern-day dictators say, "Whoa, maybe take it down a notch." Let's start our journey with someone who makes Cersei Lannister look like Mother Teresa. I'm talking about Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, who turned political backstabbing into an art form. Quite literally. Wu Zetian's rise to power began as a low-ranking concubine. But don't let that fool you. She had the ambition of a lion and the patience of a spider waiting for its prey. Here's a fun fact. When Wu wanted to eliminate her rivals, she didn't just have them killed. No, that would be too boring. Instead, she invented new methods of torture, including something called human ice cream, where victims were tied up in the winter cold and had water slowly poured over them until they froze to death. But wait, it gets better or worse, depending on your perspective. Wu had her own daughter strangled to death in her crib, then blamed the empress for it. Talk about a power move. She eventually became so powerful that she created her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, and ruled China with an iron fist wrapped in silk. But here's the twist. Despite her ruthlessness, Wu Zetian actually turned out to be one of China's most effective rulers. She expanded the empire, improved agriculture, and even implemented a merit-based bureaucratic system. Speaking of effective but terrifying rulers, let's hop over to Russia and meet Ivan the Terrible. And let me tell you, he didn't get that nickname because he was terrible at playing chess. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at the tender age of 3. Yes, you heard that right. While most 3-year-olds are learning to use a spoon, little Ivan was learning how to rule a nation. Now, you might think having such responsibilities at a young age would make someone mature faster. Well, in Ivan's case, it just made him terrible. Here's a charming anecdote. When Ivan's first wife died, he was convinced she had been poisoned. His response? He started boiling people alive. Just a normal, measured reaction to grief, right? But hold on to your crowns, because we're just getting started. Still to come, you will meet a queen who made jewelry out of children's bones, a king who turned his enemies' skulls into drinking cups, and a ruler who was so paranoid, he had his own shadow executed for treason. Part 2. When Royalty Goes Rogue. Let's talk about Elizabeth Báthory, also known as the Blood Countess. Now, if you're eating while watching this, you might want to put that sandwich down. Trust me on this one. Elizabeth wasn't technically a queen, but she was a countess from one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, and boy, did she make the most of that privilege. You see, while most noble women of her time were busy organizing tea parties and matchmaking, Elizabeth had a slightly different hobby: bathing in the blood of young virgins. Yes, you heard that right. She believed that bathing in the blood of young women would keep her eternally young. Talk about an extreme skincare routine. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Elizabeth kept meticulous records of her victims. She was basically the world's first serial killer with a spreadsheet. The official count? 650 young women. That's not a typo. She literally could have filled a small village with her victims. Now, you might be wondering, how did she get away with this for so long? Well, When you're rich, powerful, and related to half of Europe's nobility, people tend to look the other way. Speaking of looking the way, let's hop over to ancient Persia and meet Xerxes I. You might remember him as that really tall, shiny guy from the movie 300. But the real Xerxes was even more extra than his Hollywood version. Here's a fun fact. When a bridge he built got destroyed by a storm, Xerxes ordered his men to give the sea 300 lashes as punishment. Yes, he tried to whip water. I guess nobody told him that's not how physics works. But wait, it gets better. He also had the builders of the bridge beheaded, because obviously it was their fault that nature did what nature does. Now, let's travel to medieval England and meet King John. The ruler's so bad that he literally made everyone agree that kings shouldn't have absolute power. You know you're doing a terrible job when your subjects force you to sign a document, the Magna Carta, that basically says, dude, you need to chill. John had this charming habit of taking noble children as hostages to ensure their parents' loyalty. When one family rebelled anyway, he starved their child to death. Parent of the Year material, he was not. But here's the truly wild part. John once lost all of England's crown jewels in a swamp. Not in a heroic battle, not to clever thieves, but because he decided to take a shortcut through a marsh during high tide. That's like losing your phone, wallet, and keys all at once, but on a royal scale. Let's not forget about Vlad the Impaler, who makes modern horror movie villains look like amateur hour. Vlad, who inspired the character Dracula, had this signature move of impaling his enemies on giant spikes and leaving them to die slowly. He once created a forest of 20,000 impaled bodies outside his capital city. Talk about a unique approach to urban landscaping. But here's the kicker. One time, when Ottoman ambassadors refused to remove their turbans in his presence, as it was against their religious customs, Vlad had the turbans nailed to their heads. His explanation: I'm just helping you follow your customs more firmly. Now that's what I call malicious compliance. And get this, Vlad once invited all the beggars in his kingdom to a great feast. They thought they were getting a free meal, but instead he locked the hall and burned it down. His explanation? He was solving poverty. I guess technically he did, but I don't think that's what people mean by eliminating poverty. Just when you think it can't get any more bizarre, wait until you hear about the next batch of rulers in our lineup. We're talking about a queen who collected dwarfs like Pokemon, a king who declared war on the ocean, again, what's with rulers and their beef with large bodies of water, and an emperor who made his horse a senator. Part 3. Royal Madness Takes the Throne. Let's meet Caligula, the Roman emperor who took eccentric to a whole new level. Imagine being so powerful that when someone says, "That's crazy," you can respond with, "No, that's Tuesday." Caligula started his reign pretty normally. If by normal you mean declaring yourself a living god and demanding people worship you. But that was just a warm-up act. Remember when I mentioned a horse becoming a senator? Well, meet Incitatus, Caligula's favorite horse. Not only did he make this horse a senator, but he also gave it a marble stable, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a full staff of servants. But here's the real kicker. He was planning to make Incitatus a consul, which was basically like making your pet the vice president. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, he was assassinated before he could promote his four-legged friend. Speaking of peculiar rulers, let's talk about Christina of Sweden, who collected dwarfs like modern people collect Instagram followers. Christina had this fascinating habit of arranging her collection of little people by height and keeping them in special cabinets. Yes, you heard that right, cabinets. Like some sort of living dollhouse. But that wasn't even her strangest quirk. She once killed a man during a ballet performance because she got bored. Talk about being a tough critic. Now, let's pivot to King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. And boy, did he earn that nickname. One day, Charles became convinced that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. He had his tailors create special reinforced clothing and refused to let anyone approach him. But wait, it gets better. He also insisted on having iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent him from breaking. Imagine being his tailor and having to deal with that order. Let's not forget about Queen Maria I of Portugal, also known as Maria the Mad. She had this charming habit of screaming so loudly that she could be heard across the palace. What was she screaming about? Well, she was convinced that she was being eternally damned for not executing enough people during her reign. That's right, she felt guilty about not killing enough people. Talk about job commitment. Speaking of commitment, let's talk about Frederick William I of Prussia, who had an obsession with incredibly tall soldiers. He created an elite regiment called the Potsdam Giants, where every soldier had to be over 6 feet tall. He was so desperate for tall soldiers that he would literally kidnap tall men from other countries. Imagine being tall in 18th century Europe and having to duck every time you heard Prussian soldiers approaching. But here's the best part. He would try to create taller soldiers by forcing his tall guardsmen to marry tall women. He was basically running a royal breeding program for height. And just when you think royal madness couldn't get any madder, we have Emperor Norton I of the United States. What's that? You've never heard of an emperor of the United States? That's because he wasn't actually an emperor. He just declared himself one. Joshua Norton was a San Francisco businessman who lost his fortune and apparently his grip on reality. In 1859, he proclaimed himself Norton I, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. The truly bizarre part? San Francisco just went along with it. He printed his own money, which local businesses accepted, wore a custom-made uniform, and was treated with reverence by the citizens. When he died, over 30,000 people attended his funeral. Now that's what I call fake it till you make it. But hold on to your crowns, because in our next segment, we're going to meet rulers who make these folks look positively normal. We're talking about a king who collected torture devices like they were Pokemon cards, a queen who turned her enemies into garden fertilizer, and an emperor who fiddled while his city burned, literally. Part 4. Royal insanity reaches new heights. You know how some people collect stamps or baseball cards? Well, King Ludwig II of Bavaria collected castles. And not just any castles. We're talking about fairy tale castles that would make Disney's Imagineers blush. Ludwig, also known as the Fairy Tale King, spent so much money building elaborate castles that he practically bankrupted Bavaria. But here's the fun part. He never actually finished most of them. One of his castles, Neuschwanstein, had a room dedicated to artificial caves. Yes, you heard that right, artificial caves. Inside a castle. Because apparently, when you're mad with power, regular rooms just won't cut it. But Ludwig's castle addiction wasn't even his strangest quirk. He used to have elaborate dinners where he would talk to imaginary guests like Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. Talk about dining with the ghosts of royalty past. Now, let's meet Emperor Nero of Rome, who really knew how to bring down the house literally. Legend has it that Nero started the Great Fire of Rome because he wanted to clear space for his new palace. And while Rome burned, he supposedly played the fiddle and watched the spectacle from a safe distance. But here's the truly wild part. After the fire, he built a massive palace called the Golden House that had a 120-foot statue of himself in the entrance. Talk about an extreme home makeover. Speaking of extreme, let's talk about Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar, nicknamed the Mad Queen of Madagascar. And trust me, she worked hard for that title. Ranavalona had this charming habit of testing her subjects' loyalty through tangina, a poison ordeal where people had to eat 3 pieces of chicken skin and swallow a poisonous nut. If they survived and managed to vomit up all 3 pieces of chicken skin, they were innocent. But wait, it gets better. She also had this thing called the Queen's Walk. When she traveled, her servants had to carry her wagon over cliffs and mountains. If they fell to their death, well, She just got new servants. Let's hop over to Russia again and meet Emperor Paul I, who had an interesting approach to fashion policing. Paul banned round hats because he thought they were revolutionary. He also banned shoelaces, certain colors of dresses, and specific ways of tying cravats. Breaking these fashion laws could get you arrested or exiled to Siberia. Imagine being sent to Siberia because you tied your necktie wrong. Talk about a strict dress code. But perhaps the crown for most peculiar royal behavior goes to Ibrahim, the Mad of the Ottoman Empire. Ibrahim had this thing about fat women. He once had his agents weigh every woman in Constantinople, and if they found one weighing more than 330 pounds, she was immediately recruited into his harem. He also had all his concubines drowned in sacks when someone suggested they might have been looking at another man. Talk about relationship issues. And let's not forget about his fur obsession. He decorated his entire palace with fur, including the walls, floors, and furniture. He even had his ship's sails made of fur, because nothing says naval supremacy like furry sails, right? But perhaps his crowning achievement of madness was when he ordered his entire harem to act like cats. Yes, you read that right. Hundreds of women crawling around the palace, meowing and purring on command. And just when you think we've reached peak royal insanity, wait until you hear about our final batch of rulers in the next segment. We're talking about a king who declared himself pope, a queen who kept her dead husband's heart in her purse for 30 years, and an emperor who made his subjects collect 100,000 nightingale tongues for a single feast. Part 5. The grand finale of royal madness. And now, for our final act in this circus of royal insanity, let's meet Henry VIII of England, the king who turned till death do us part into more of a threat than a vow. You might know Henry as the king with 6 wives, but did you know he once declared himself the Pope? Yes, when the actual Pope wouldn't let him divorce his first wife, Henry basically said, "Fine, I'll make my own church, with blackjack and divorces." Speaking of relationship drama, let me introduce you to Joanna the Mad of Castile. Now, that's what I call dedication to love, or perhaps obsession is a better word. When her husband Philip died, Joanna refused to bury him. Instead, she carried his coffin everywhere she went for 9 months. She would occasionally open it to check if he had come back to life. But wait, it gets better. She once stopped a funeral procession because she was convinced the dead woman was trying to have an affair with her deceased husband's corpse. That's taking jealousy to a whole new level. Now, let's talk about Sultan Ahmed I of the Ottoman Empire, who had this peculiar obsession with nightingales. He once ordered his subjects to collect 100,000 nightingale tongues for a single feast. Why? Because he believed eating them would make him sing as beautifully as the birds themselves. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But hey, at least he tried, right? But perhaps the award for most creative use of human remains goes to Ismail the Bloodthirsty of Morocco. Ismail had this charming habit of decorating his palace walls with the heads of his enemies. But that's not even the weird part. He kept meticulous records of each head and would regularly quiz his servants about who each head belonged to. Get this, if a servant got the answer wrong, their head would join the collection. Talk about a high-stakes pop quiz. And for our grand finale, let me introduce you to Emperor Zhengde of Ming Dynasty China, who took playing pretend to an entirely new level. Zhengde would regularly sneak out of his palace to pretend he was a commoner, which sounds kind of sweet until you learn that he built a miniature city inside his palace, where he would force his courtiers to pretend to be shopkeepers. He also once declared war on a village just so he could play soldier. When his advisors told him there was no real threat, he hired bandits to attack the village so he could save it. But perhaps his most bizarre act was when he decided to become a postman for a day. He delivered actual imperial edicts himself, riding through the streets yelling, "Special delivery from the emperor," which was technically true, I suppose. And there you have it, folks. A journey through the most bizarre, ruthless, and downright crazy rulers in human history. Remember that next time you think your boss is being unreasonable, At least they're not making you collect nightingale tongues or quizzing you about the severed heads on the wall. And here's a final thought to keep you up at night. These people weren't just characters in some twisted fairy tale. They actually ruled nations, commanded armies, and shaped the course of human history. Have a great day, everyone. And remember, if you ever find yourself in a position of absolute power, maybe take it easy on the severed heads and fur-covered ships.